Yay.
There it is.
You can move this now. Ooh.
Everything got very quiet all of a sudden.
I know.
Because you're being recorded.
That's right. All right. Well, I know some others might join us, but I'm going to begin with a prayer. This is a prayer that's from our hymnal, and it's a prayer for peace among nations, something that we obviously need
That today.
Yes. Let us pray. Gracious God, grant peace among nations. Cleanse from our own hearts the seeds of strife, greed, and envy, harsh misunderstandings and ill will, fear and desire for revenge. Make us quick to welcome ventures in cooperation among the peoples of the world, so that there may be woven the fabric of a common good, too strong to be torn by the evil hands of war. In the time of opportunity, make us be diligent, and in the time of peril, let not our courage fail. Through Jesus Christ, our Savior and Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Well, welcome everyone. We're going to begin each week by reciting our portion of the Catechism. So this week we are on Commandments 4 and 5. So if you'll turn your books to page 211, and as we're going to do each week, is I will cite the reference, then I will ask the question, and then everybody will answer with the response, which is the way that we would have done it. So it's on page 211, the fourth and fifth commandment. And again, I think as I've mentioned before, this is something that might have been done at the dinner table every night with the family. As they gathered around, they would recite these different parts of the catechism. All right, so the fourth commandment, honor your father and your mother. What does this mean? We are to fear
and love God,
so that we
So
neither
that we
despise
neither
nor
anger our
parents
and others in authority,
but
but instead honor, serve, obey, love, and respect them.
The fifth commandment, you shall not murder. What does this mean? We are to fear
and love God, so that we may neither endanger nor harm the lives of our neighbors, but instead help and support them in all of life's needs.
Okay, so we just have those two commandments this week. And as I've mentioned the past couple of weeks, the 10 commandments are sort of broken into our responsibility towards God and our responsibilities toward each other. The first three, not having any other gods, not making wrongful use of God's name, and honoring the Sabbath, have to do with our relationship with honoring God and keeping God as first in our lives. But now the other 7 commandments now get into our relationship with one another. And the first one that we have this week, the fourth commandment, is about honoring our parents. And then the fifth commandment is thou shalt not murder. So we're going to take a little closer look at what these commandments might mean. One of the things I hope you noticed about both of Luther's responses this week is not only are we to do something, but he has in both these, but instead. So It's just not a negative, there's also a positive. So with the fourth commandment, not only are we supposed to honor our parents, but also others in authority, and instead, not only don't dishonor them, but instead honor, serve, obey, love, and respect them. And of course, one of the things that Luther was very big on was this idea that authority has been placed there by God, and that the order that we have in the universe, families, societies, can be there to help us. Now, I think Luther would be the first to admit that none of our families are perfect. If you have a perfect family, hold up your hand. Right? No, yeah, exactly. We've all got our stuff. We've all got families that can sometimes cause problems. The same with our society, our cities, our towns, our legislatures. They're not always perfect, but Luther believed that there was an order to things, and if we recognize this order, Luther called it the orders of creation. We could see God's hand at work in these things. Now, if that society becomes ungodly, or if the parents abuse the child, then some things need to be done to rectify that situation or replace that society or that tyranny that people have on other. But Luther basically saw these sort of orders of creation as a good thing and something they could use. He'll get in trouble with this because he also, as it mentioned, he gets involved with a peasants' revolt where basically he supports the elector of Saxony over the peasants and says, "Yeah, just go ahead and kill them. Who cares?" Because you're the order of the day. So we can talk a little bit about that. On page 58, where we started this week, you can see there the picture of Luther's parents. I'm not sure those are the most handsome pictures that I've ever seen in my life. I don't know what you think about them, but both Hans and Marguerite Luther, or Luther as perhaps their name was originally, looked a little weather worn and up in years. Are you all looking at the pictures? Am I the only one that thinks they look a little bit?
Yeah, we're looking.
Yeah, they look a little haggard.
Exactly. You can see a little Luther and his father there, but his parents do look a little haggard. It's also fair to say that Luther was not destitute. He came from a family that had some means. I mean, I'm not saying they were uber wealthy or anything like that, but his father had a job. They had some money. For one thing, they were wanted to send their son to university, which not everybody did in those days, obviously. And so obviously they were a family of some substance. They wanted Martin to continue in that tradition. And of course, Martin does not honor his parents because he does the very thing his father does not want to do, and that is he decides to go into the monastery. The story is that Luther was out one day and he got caught in a thunderstorm. And he promised that if God saved him from the thunderstorm, he would enter the monastery. That's one of the stories, at least. And so when he was saved from the storm, he went into the monastery. But I actually think it was more than that. I think Luther had a deep sense of spirituality in his life and wasn't finding that just being part of a law career. He wanted to dig deeper into his own spirituality and his sense of God. And so that's why he entered the monastery, much to the chagrin of his father, who, for a time, if you read, really didn't want to talk to him about it and almost disowned him for going not into the legal profession where there might be some money, but basically taking a vow of poverty and chastity and entering the monastery at the time. You can see there at the middle of page 58 that it was only later in life where they finally reconciled their problems that they had. So this idea of honoring parents sometimes also means that we have to put up with their anger when we don't do what they want us to do. And certainly Luther received the wrath of his father. And it's interesting, though, that he goes back then and says, but we are still to understand them as part of God's order and not to anger them, because that's not what he did. But he saw some value in that. Of course, we also know that he had, 6 kids of his own. A couple of them died as very young children. the one less than a year old, Hans, Elizabeth, and then Magdalena, who died as she was, what's that, 13? That would make her. So we had a couple of children die in childbirth, which of course in those days was not completely unheard of. I think most large families had children that died either during childbirth or shortly after. I think as they mentioned on the next page, death and destruction and the plague were very present in Europe at this time. So a lot of people had a sense of death and dying. The other thing is that they were closer to it in general than we are today. Most of us do not live on farms today. And so if you live on a farm, you see the cycle of life with animals and dying, et cetera, et cetera. We don't have as much of that. And then even some of the experiences we have with death aren't as visceral as they used to be. Most of us use a funeral home for the preparation of the body, do we not? And whereas that used to be the job of a family to prepare the body for burial. And there's some ways in which we separated ourselves from those very basic things. The whole process of preserving a body for a viewing, where we embalm the body. Of course, we know they did this in ancient Egypt, but that practice in America really only came about at the turn of the 20th century. This idea that we would embalm a body, and essentially what you're doing, and it is sort of a denial of death if you think about it. I'm not saying that any practice you did it was horrible. I'm just saying if you think about it from a macro level, the idea of embalming a body is making the body look as if it did when it was alive. Are you with me? Nobody goes to a funeral home and looks at a body in a casket that has not been embalmed. Because if they did, that body would naturally start to get rigor. It would start to smell, just like having a piece of steak out on the counter all afternoon. You with me? So we have found ways to separate ourselves from that. Even if the body, for instance, I want to be cremated, normally we're not part of that process. We just receive the ashes afterwards. So there's ways in which we've separated ourselves from death. That was not possible in Luther's day. They all knew people in their villages that died. They all had people in their family. Women, during childbirth, there was a lot of death of women during childbirth because we didn't have the medicine that we do today. And many women died during childbirth. Many men then might be married 3 or 4 times because their wives would die during childbirth. So there was a greater familiarity with death. And also, I guess I want to say the need for a family structure that supported you. Because if you didn't have that, it would be very hard to live on your own. Nowadays, we can do it more, can we not? I mean, we can go to a grocery, we can have a refrigerator, we have ways we're not dependent on a family to grow food and eat and all those things that they were. And in some ways that separates us, right? Does it not? From that sort of family unit. Now, some of this, it's not all bad because, I mean, some of this allows people to live the life they choose and not to be bound up in a family. But it also sometimes separates us from those sort of core community things. You with me on that, or what are your thoughts?
Did Luther have brothers and sisters? I assume he must have.
I don't know. I
time.
assume he did. Yeah, I think he did. It's not listed here, and I don't know just off the top of my head, but I assume he would have. Yes.
Yeah, it seems that if he had a large family, that it wouldn't be as much of a blow to the parents if he went into the monastery if others did not.
Right, because somebody else could take up the. Yeah, I don't know that, and we'll have to research that and see. But I assume he had other brothers and sisters. But it was just that his father, I think, wanted him. Did you notice that they thought he was sort of their social security? That if you have a son who makes money, then you take care of them the first 18 years, they take care of you the last 18 years, right? I'm sure you've all heard that as well. Okay. The other thing, of course, in the Bible, when we looked at the 10 Commandments, do you remember that honor your father and mother, for you will live long in the land? That's not included in the commandments, but I've always liked that part of it as well. Okay. Luther also relates this. I mean, the author here also relates this whole sort of fourth commandment and the honoring of parents, the respecting of authority, to have something to do with vocation in our lives. I don't know if you caught that or not. This is especially on page 58 and 59. This idea that our vocations in life are how we work out God's spirit among us. Vocation is
I
from
found
the
that.
Latin. Go ahead.
I found that term confusing because to me, a vocation is what you do for a living.
Right. But it comes from the Latin voxe, voice, to call. So Lutherans have always thought about our vocation as also our calling. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean just to the priesthood or to the ministry. So you can be called to whatever you do. Some people are called, to raise a family. Some people are called to work in the tech industry. Some people are called to be lawyers or judges, just anything that it is. Luther believed that part of understanding God's spirit in our lives was to seek out what is it that God is calling us to. And that doesn't mean religious orders for Luther. That could be a physician, that could be an actor, it could be anything. And the idea was, how is God calling you into what you do? That's what he means by vocation. So if you look on page 59, the last of the last of the first paragraph there, our vocations are the place God's fingers move in the world, the way God creates and tends life. So Luther had this strong sense that God is working through this. We're going to see this in the explanation to the Apostles' Creed as well, that God is working in me. We've been signed and sealed at our baptism with the cross. And now, how does God want to use me? And so I don't know if some of you had a chance to hear Vicar Jenny's first sermon, where she talked about her calling, and that for a time in her life, she didn't want to listen to that call of God. And then eventually that call sort of got her, and she decided to go into the ministry. But I would say that that's whatever we do. We have to ask the question, how is God calling us to that? And how do we serve God in whatever it is that we do? Whether it's a nurse or working in a hotel or whatever. Luther saw what we do as our vocation, from Latin voxe, calling, God's voice in our lives. What's your calling when you retire? Do you still have a calling? Anybody?
I suppose you would have to have.
Yeah, I think you have a calling every day of your life. I mean, I think we wake up in the morning and at some point we have to decide, what is God calling me to this day? How can I do something that would affect somebody else's life for the better? How is God working? And so I think we all need to struggle with that and think about that. That doesn't mean we can't retire from our professional job, but I believe even in retirement, God calls us to do things. Some of what we need is help to figure out what that is, right? So let's have a little bit of fun right now, okay? Let's go around. What do you think God is calling you to right now in your life, okay? Now I'm just going to pick random names, all right? So what do you think God is calling you to, okay? Luther believed, that God is calling each of us to something. What do you think God is calling you to right now? Let's start with you, Pete, because you're on my left side. And I'll just make my way around my circle here. What's God calling you to, Pete?
I don't know. I'd have to give that some thought. If it's not this thing that I've been doing all along.
Okay. So it's not what you get for you. It's not what you're getting paid to do. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no.
Sometimes we work for something and God calls us something else.
Well, I got the impression from what you were saying that this is something that may change from hour to hour, or day to day, or whatever. But I mean, to me, I've been, I do computer programming. I think I'm good at it. I enjoy it. There's times the company kind of drives me a little crazy, but otherwise I'm perfectly fine with it. As far as I know,
Right.
that's what God called me to do. For, he gave me a talent in that respect, and
Exactly.
if he wants me to do something else, I don't know what it is.
Okay, keep your ears on. Okay, Sharon, what's God calling you today these days? Sharon Nail.
Hey, my husband had cancer and I took care of him for 6 years. When he died, then it became my calling to help other people with cancer who were dying and with hospice to go through those final few weeks. And I took care of my two brothers, and one friend in the last 3 to 6 months of their life. So that became my calling, but I haven't done that now for maybe 3 years. So since then, I haven't really discovered if I have another calling in coming up or not, but I'm open to whatever comes.
Well, and also the last 3 years we've been separated with COVID and other things too. We haven't had the chance to mingle or be with one another either. Okay, good. Barbara, I've got you next up on my screen. I'm just going around my screen. I think every screen's a little different. But Barbara, what's God calling you to these days? What's your vocation? You have to take your mute off. You have to unmute.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Right now, I feel my calling is through my church. We have recently lost our minister. She resigned, and we are in total flux and transition. I am on council, and I'm there to serve and try to keep our church alive.
Wow. Well, it's a tough time for every church when they lose a leader, but I think any leader, but especially a pastor, can be sort of the glue, and yeah, that's hard. Well, blessings on that journey. I'm glad you're there helping them out. Well, Nancy, what's God calling you these days as you look over the Scioto River there?
Yeah. Well, before it was raising my family, which I did all by myself. And I had 4 children, and they were left to me to raise. And they all turned out nice. They're nice, loving kids. So I'm very proud of that fact. Now that my husband just died, I think my calling is to learn more about God and my religion, and I have time now to really get into that I didn't have before. I mean, I shouldn't have said that because but I was so busy my whole life that I couldn't handle everything. So now I can. So that's my calling now.
Okay. Well, maybe God was waiting for you all this time. So good.
I hope so.
All right. I'm sure. Eric and Heidi, what is God calling you guys to this day?
Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yep, perfectly.
I think that I'm called to help fellow alcoholics and addicts. That's my profession. I'm also feeling a call. Yep. I'm feeling the call right now. One of our daughters is pregnant. She's due December 3rd. So we're tasked with a lot of help with her, and certainly we're working on our 6th grandchild. So we are often, I feel like the vocation of parenting and grandparenting is a constant call for me. And now that they are out of the house, I do also feel this call with nurturing my relationship more with God and spending more time with him personally than really I ever have, quite frankly. So there's a few vocations feeling called to right now.
Yeah, sometimes, I mean, honestly, I know some of you saying that at this point in life you were busy, but really, I think people that are raising children and working full time, I don't know how you have time to breathe a lot of times. It just seems like, I look at the young parents we have in our congregation, they're just hustling all the time. And it's hard. And there's just so many more things that their kids are involved in than I think most of the time my mom just said, just get outside and blow the stink off you and I'll call you when it's time to dinner. But nowadays it seems like these parents are really run in a million different ways. Eric, what's God calling you to?
Yeah, I'm currently called in the world of IT. I spent a fair amount of time on the programming side. I haven't done so much of that lately. But also, as Heidi mentioned, the call for getting ready for that 6th grade child and making sure the other 5 are doing well and hoping and helping the parents and supporting them.
Excellent. Good. Alice, you're next on my rota here.
Well, it's interesting, just listening to everybody. I do have a means for an income, which I enjoy, but just listening to everybody, I kept thinking, I think I'm not successful every day, so I'm not gonna toot my horn on this fact. But what I'm hearing is that every one of us is trying to be loving and caring and nurturing through our work or whatever to whoever we come in contact with. And I think maybe that's our vocation.
Yeah. And that's exactly what Luther would say. It can be, I mean, he used to talk about it. You can be from the local blacksmith to a doctor. I mean, everybody has something that they're contributing and need to do. Yes. Thank you. We have a Zoom user. I don't have a name, but also maybe they just want to listen. Does Zoom user want to chime in here, or just are you just listening? Okay, well, you're welcome to listen. That's no problem at all. So Luther believed that there was an order to society and that we need to respect and honor that order. Part of that order is also finding our place in that order. What is our vocation and what is our calling in the midst of that? All right, let's move on here then. He does get a little, I just want to give a little history here. There was a peasants' revolt in northern Germany during Luther's time. It happened in 1525, according to the book here. I didn't know exactly what happened. They say 1525. And what happened is they began to revolt because of they were working on the land. They were always just given barely, starving wages. And so they rose up in the time of the Reformation, in which, we were talking about giving people dignity and and we ought to have rights and we ought to be valued. And they were talking about that as part of the Reformation. Well, then lo and behold, they said, yeah, you're right. We ought to. Well, then what happened is they began to strike, to not work. And Luther, benefactor in Saxony, wanted to just destroy them and put an end to it. And Luther basically gave him carte blanche for that, which was not, I think, Luther's finest moment in the history of the world. But again, as we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, we don't worship Martin Luther. He did some wonderful things, but I don't think this was his best moment. But you can also understand how he came to that understanding. He believed in the order of society. So if you're a peasant and you're a laborer, that's what you're supposed to do. If you're the elector of Saxony, that's what you're supposed to do. If you're a parent, you're a parent. If you're a child, you're a child. If you're a pastor, you see what I'm saying? And so by that idea, he didn't think the peasants had the right to change their status. Now, maybe today he would totally disagree with that, and I hope that he would. But he basically gave the powers that be right to take care of the situation, and they did. I mean, by some counts, they have 150,000 peasants died as a result of Luther's words. And that's very tragic because of
Paul also felt that way too, didn't he? And then that where Luther got it from Paul's.
Right. When Paul talks about the kingdom of this world and the kingdoms, that they have a right to do that. Exactly. and Sharon's talking about St. Paul. If you look in Romans, I think it's like Romans 14, 13, 14 in there, where he talks about the powers and principalities, that they have a right to exist. And that is where Luther got it from. Unfortunately, if those powers are benevolent and just and righteous, it might work out. But if those powers are evil or seeking their own gain, they can also be sinful, and they can use that against people. But yeah, it's a dangerous thing. If you ever want to look it up, I think it's Romans 14, but we should be subject to the governing authorities. Are you hearing me now? Do you hear where that verse comes from? Be subject to the governing authorities. Okay, but what happens when that governing authority is evil? You know, what happened in Nazi Germany when Hitler, was using his power to abuse people, to kill Jews, etc. At what point does the gospel have to rise above the powers that be? It's a problem. I'm sorry, Pete.
I've seen, I know I've read Paul when he says to be subject to, people and everything, but I've never thought about that structure as being part of the fourth commandment before. To me, it's honor your father and mother. And here it seems to be saying honor everybody who is in authority over you.
That's authority.
And I've never heard that before.
Yeah, that's Luther's understanding. By the way, I just checked. It's Romans 13 is what Sharon's referring to. If you want to look at it after the class, it's Romans 13 about being subject. But I think Paul interprets it more broadly. And I don't know if this was the case when you were growing up, but in our neighborhood that I grew up in, when we knew all the people, and my aunt and uncle lived a few houses down, and we knew people in the church. When I was growing up, any adult had the right to correct me and discipline me. Now, I'm not saying they had the right to spank me, because they didn't, but they certainly had the right to correct me or tell my parents that I had done something wrong. I don't see that as much today. So, for instance, if you're in the grocery store going down the aisle and the mother of the 8-year-old kid is in the next aisle, and you see the 8-year-old kid pulling all the baked beans off the shelf, how many times are you going to go to that kid and say, hey, put those back, stop that? I think most of us don't want to get involved. Isn't that true? Most of us would just
get in trouble for that these days.
Right, exactly. But wasn't there a time when almost any parent in the church or in your neighborhood could say, John, you shouldn't be doing that, or you broke that window, and I'm going to tell your parents about it, and you're going to have to pay for it. But nowadays, I think there's every parent, we're not supposed to be parenting other kids, right? There's sort of a standoffishness, which I'm not sure that's great either. I mean, I don't know that I necessarily liked growing up with every eye in the neighborhood being able to correct me either, but it was a different time. Nowadays, we can't use that at all. So, all right. So the structure, Luther interprets this commandment pretty broadly, and be appreciative of all, not only parents and the family, but all structures in your life. The fifth commandment, you shall not murder. Again, it starts with fearing and love God, and then but instead help them. All right. One of the things I wanted to take a little bit of time and talk about today, I mentioned this, I think, briefly in the other classes. In the Hebrew Bible, the prohibition that's being given here is homicide. In other words, you are not to kill another person in anger or for gain or out of jealousy or because you want something that they have. That's murder. And we define that in our society as homicide. That, we have manslaughter, we have all the things. But what's clearly being talked about here in the Bible is God's prohibition against us killing each other in rage or anger. It is not thou shalt not kill. There are lots of instances in the Old Testament where permission is given to kill people, right? If you utter the name of a god, you can be stoned to death. If you commit adultery, the woman, of course, and Jesus defends the woman, but she's being stoned to death, or was about to be, because she committed adultery. Now, where's the man in all that? I don't know. But at any rate, you know the scene in John 6 where that happens. But the prohibition here is not about killing, because sometimes the Israelites killed whole villages or killed thousands and thousands of Philistines in war. So there was definitely killing that went on. But the idea here is murder. And so when we think about what's being prohibited here, I wish it was broader, to be honest. So, for instance, one of the persons that I have taken a lot of that I have a lot of respect for is the late Cardinal Joseph Bernardine of Chicago. I don't know if any of you know him or knew some of his writings, but he wrote about this, what he called the ethic of life. And what he believed was that God created life and that human beings should not be taking that life away. That we are created in the image of God. When God created us, and the Bible says that we are very good, right, on that sixth day, that in the creation of human beings, that is sacred and holy. And therefore, we don't have the right as human beings to be taking that life away. What I liked about Cardinal Bernardine was that he was consistent. So therefore, he was opposed to abortion on all levels, as are most of the Catholic Church. But he was also opposed to the death penalty for the same reasons. And some of the sort of interesting twists in current, you know, political groups is that some of the people that are anti-abortion or pro-life are also pro-capital punishment. And that was one thing that Cardinal Bernardine especially was very opposed to, because what he said, if we have to respect life, if we want to respect life, we have to respect all life. So not only should the state not be involved in abortion, the state also shouldn't be involved in capital punishment, in taking people's lives at the other end. So what I liked about him was his consistency. Now, I would also say that that does not describe my entire position on the subject. I, with Cardinal Bernardine, agree that life is very precious and a gift of God. But I would also say there are some instances, death of the mother, rape, incest, where a medical decision might be made to terminate a pregnancy. I'm never happy about that. I think that should only happen after careful prayer and consideration of all the options. But I do not think that if abortion is done in an extreme circumstances, that is the same as murdering someone. There's always, it's not a good situation. It's certainly not something we want to happen, but there are times when abortion could be done or the pregnancy could be terminated that I think is the most gracious thing that could be done with a respect for life. And I also, I'm sort of tipping my hand here, but I also believe that a woman's body, she should have some say over that. And I generally would counsel people not to have an abortion if it's simply for birth control or convenience. I would be a strong no on that. But there are other times when I have been party to conversations where I have simply said, I believe strongly in life that you have to decide what you want to do here. Do you know what I mean? And it can be a very difficult situation. I know women who have carried babies to term when they knew after 8 months the baby was dead. And yet they were not allowed to do anything until they could induce labor. And so they carried that dead baby for another month. What do we do when we know early on in the pregnancy that the fetus does not have a brain or a heart or things like this? What do we do? These are medical things that we know now because we can see inside the body through MRIs and ultrasounds that the biblical world never imagined. And they simply had the respect for life and wanted pregnancies to go until they were terminated, either by the death of the child or by the live birth. So it's a very difficult subject today. So Alice, go ahead.
I was just thinking, though, within the last, maybe it's now 70 years, medical science has changed dramatically over these years, whereas any of those other not all of them, but many of what you were saying, if a child doesn't have a brain or is not forming well, that child, even if it survived a birth, would probably pass quickly. Whereas now little babies can be born at 2 ounces or, 2 pounds, maybe not 2 ounces. That's not very much,
Right.
2 pounds. And they can, or 1 pound even to some degree. And because of modern medicine now, they can certainly be saved. So it is a very, I think it's very difficult. I am grateful that it was a choice I never had to face, but I'm in agreement with you. This is something that I don't know how anybody but a woman and God can make this decision, and how it ever got into the law is beyond me.
Right. The other thing into this whole thing comes in vitro fertilization, where a couple will go and they will fertilize 7, 8, 9 eggs. These eggs are stored. A lot of them are already fertilized. What do we do then? What about a person who wants to be impregnated from a sperm bank? What do we do there? There's a lot of questions here that I find very difficult. What I wanted, Barbara, I saw your hand. What I want to uphold is that life is sacred and important. So let's take these decisions as seriously as we can, pray about them, but sometimes a hard decision has to be made for the life of the mother. Or sometimes, we don't know, maybe both the child and the mother might die. What do we do? It's very difficult. And rather than having black and white rules, I want to say, let's start with the respect for life and then see where can that lead us so that we can still have respect for life, sometimes in the midst of tragedy too. Barbara.
I wasn't really raising my hand. I just wanted to say I totally agree with you. Totally agree.
Okay. Any other thoughts or comments? And of course, now it's at the ballot box, and we're going to go to the ballot box here in Ohio, at least, to try to decide this issue, which is is a very difficult issue. And I'm not wild about pastors going on TV and saying you should do this or that. I mean, I've seen it on both sides recently. I'm not wild about that. But I know that I struggle myself with this issue. Other thoughts, or people want to chime in?
I don't know if I should bring this up or not, but when I with my third child, I faced this, and German measles was going around at that time, and they were saying that if you got the German measles and you were pregnant in the first 3 months, do any of you women remember that? Well, I did get it. My daughter brought it home from school to me. I had never had the German measles, and I got it. So I had 3 doctors. I went to 3 doctors. So what should I do? And they advised me to have an abortion. All of them. And I pondered on that, and I thought, I just can't do that. Then I'm going to take the chance. And that was my decision. And it turned out that there was a 2-week period in there, because the doctor told me that he observed these other 2 women who had also gotten the German measles, but it was just like a difference of a week to 2 weeks in their development. And they did not have the luck I had. So that was really stressful pregnancy, let's put it. But I made the decision to, I just couldn't do it. So I made a decision.
And I think that is also a faithful decision. But what I hear you saying and what I want is for us to wrestle with these things from the standpoint of life is so sacred, but also what does it mean when we have other knowledge and what should we do with that knowledge? Sometimes you just have to take a chance. I think like you decided that you didn't know for sure, that's a faithful decision. But if these other women had decided to get an abortion at the time, I also wouldn't be condemning them for doing that.
Oh,
I want to say, as long as they prayed about it and tried to respect life as best they can, I'm not going to be their judge on what happened. Do you see what I mean? It's possible that both things could have happened. And I'm glad that your outcome was very good.
oh,
I
I'm
mean,
so
God,
thankful.
yeah. But and sometimes you don't know. But the
We had
reality is, I think,
We had
isn't
the
it true that
pediatrician waiting right there when he was born. He came to the hospital and was waiting. He checked him all over and he came in and told me he's perfect. Oh my God, I said.
but see, don't you think medicine is going to become more and more advanced all the time? So now we're also going to, and we're already doing this to some extent. I mean, we are going to start playing creator by things like designing designer babies. So I'm going to go through a catalog and say, okay, these are going to be my sperm donors. And we don't even want to carry the baby. So we're going to get a sperm donor, an egg, and put it in somebody else, and then it's going to be our child. And we want brown eyes, and we want. Do you see what we're doing here? And by the way, much of this technology is available today, and I also think a lot of it is going to be more and more so available. And the other thing is, then what do we do? So we know somebody is going to be born Down syndrome. Do we then abort that child or not? And do Down syndrome children, do some of them bring life and joy to this world? And do you understand what I'm saying? It becomes very, very difficult for all these decisions. What I want them to be done is to be thought about in the context of faith, that we respect life, we believe God is the creator of the universe. We should not pretend that we are the creators. And as it says in the Bible, there is no thou shalt not kill. It's thou shalt not murder. And I do not believe that a medical decision based with all the information in a faithful way is the same as homicide. I do not believe those are the same things. At the same time, as pastor for people who have had an abortion, it is hard, because how do we teach them about forgiveness? Because some people don't want to forgive themselves right away if they regret what they did later. There's all those kinds of things. And how do we as a people of faith struggle through that? And it is a struggle, and we need everything we can to try to make our way through. But the important thing is to separate out what the Bible says and what it doesn't say. And so I'm not simply going to judge somebody to have an abortion. I think 99.9% of the time I would say don't have an abortion. But there's that 0.1% where it may be necessary. But again, that's a decision with the doctor, the parents, everybody to come to in the context of faith. So murder, you're talking about here. If you'll flip the page here just to wrap up this discussion, we see that Luther, during this time to save his life, was abducted, spent time at the Wartburg. Does anybody remember what famous thing did Luther do at the Wartburg while he was there? He translated the Bible. So he was there was an edict sent that says you're outside of the Catholic faith. He basically was on the most wanted list in Germany at that time. And they grabbed him and put him in this castle at the Wartburg in Eisenach, Germany. And he used that time to translate both the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Old Testament from Hebrew, the New Testament of Greek, into the language of the people in German, the vernacular. So he used that time, obviously, very wisely when his life.
That probably didn't endear him much to the Catholic Church either.
Well, yeah, no, probably not, because now somebody else knew about the faith. Yes. Yeah. I like one of the things I like, and I think our Lord talks about this too, is that sometimes when we think about thou shalt not murder, you only think about homicide, but there's ways in which we take life away from people by doing other things. And I like down in the very last paragraph that we keep from killing in any form: bullying, shaming, torture, abuse. I mean, there's other ways that we injure people, not just by taking their life. That's an obvious one, but there are many other ways in which we hurt people. Some of you know that old phrase about sticks and stones may break my bones, but names can never hurt me. You know, kids say that. That's bull.
That's wrong.
I mean, that's absolutely wrong. Yeah, sometimes I'd rather get hit by a stick than called a nasty name or be embarrassed in front of your friends or whatever it is. I think sometimes the names and things that people say to us are as hurtful as the stick and stone that somebody throws at us. Do you know what I'm saying? And I think that I don't know why human beings have been adept at using words to really hurt people, but they do. If you've been around kids at all, and they, you know, kids are innocent, been around kids at all, I mean, they can hurt one another. And I really struggle today in ways in which social media it's so much easier. It was bad enough to be called a name on the playground in front of whoever was there, but then to broadcast it over social media and constantly being able to repeat it and to isolate people and to it's just a very sad commentary on the way, you know, a wonderful tool to reach out to people can also be a way of abusing people through social media and the kind of bullying. And we talk a lot about this with our confirmands, which was something I never had to deal with growing up. I'm not saying I never had to deal with a bully going down the hall in high school or something. I think we all had to deal with that. But this idea that someone would say such horrible things about you and then it get picked up and repeated over and over again, not just on one social media platform, but on several, is, you know, it was one thing I'm sure growing up as a girl when the girls chit chatted and passed notes and things, but social media has allowed it at such a higher level. And it also doesn't allow them to get away from it. You know, these kids are kids. They're glued to their phones. And when that stuff rings and comes across there, it's just like a constant barrage. And I think that's really one of the sad things. I do like that more and more schools are simply not allowing them to have their phones at all in the classrooms. So there's teachers that have things at the door, places you can put your phone. I mean, obviously they have to have them for safety, but I was hearing some parents say the junior high, you just can't have your phone, period. And you don't use it the whole day. At the end of the day, if you need to call mom or dad for a ride or whatever, or if there's an emergency, but otherwise, no phones. But I struggle with the impact of that because that's not really something I ever had to deal with, nor did I ever get my image of who I was by social media. I mean, that's just, I mean, to this day, I don't really care, you know, what's said out there, but it's so damaging. And I wonder, I mean, and I also know, and Heidi, I know that you've been in this world, but so many of our kids are also nowadays on some sort of medicine. I read statistics that 60% of junior high kids are on some sort of maintenance medicine. You know, whether it's something for depression or even, you know, ADHD or something, but that's a lot. I don't remember that. I'm not saying I didn't know anybody who felt bad when I was growing up or was depressed, but not at that level. And I don't know what we can do about it either. It saddens me, this sort of peer pressure that's coming over the internet and the ways of defaming people and killing them, as it were, with their words. So, any comments that anybody has? I mean, anybody have the solution in their back pocket?
When you mentioned that so many teenagers are taking some kind of medication, that rang a bell with me because my granddaughter and grandson, who are both just beginning teenagers, 13 and 11, are both on some kind of medication, but it's I think when you said that, I thought it right away of all the broken marriages, and because that's why they're having trouble adjusting to a broken marriage, and dad living there, mom living here, going back and forth. And I think that is a huge contributing factor to so many teenagers needing some kind of support medically because they're not getting it in the home.
Mm-hmm.
And they have nothing to do with drugs to get high. It's drugs to help you deal with your anxieties.
Right. Heidi, do you have any thoughts, or what have you found? Heidi is a psychologist and meets with families. I'm not asking you to reveal confidences. I'm just asking, what do you have any thoughts?
It's, I don't, life was, what I can tell you is I'm 59 and I have a 6-year-old grandson who is on an ADD medication now. And I watch this across the spectrum of all these kids diagnosed with bipolar disorder. That's kind of the diagnosis of this decade. ADD, ADHD, same. And I just think that I think as parents and as families, we've got so busy that we've lost the vocation of the work and the work of parenting. To be honest, I think life is so overwhelming for families and parents to have to, for manage financial reasons. And parenting is hard, man. It's hard. And when you have a teacher look at you and say, hey, go do this, it seems like a solve. And oftentimes it is helpful for children in school, and I get that. But I have trouble believing that, 30 years ago, we didn't even hear of these disorders.
Right.
And yet our penal system has exploded with mental illness issues as well. And today versus 30, 50 years ago. So there has to be something, to me, of the breakdown of the family. I think of the community, and even of our oftentimes our connection to the village, being part of that, being the church. I know it's and the erosion of all those societal safety, just like you were saying, John. My parents knew what I did before I knew I did it, practically, where I grew up. And the village did. The village, by the way, I was a Lutheran pastor's kid, so that's part of it. But the village did watch after us in our school district and at church and our community. And I just don't see, I'm so saddened because I don't see that for my grandchildren.
No, I don't either.
I don't see them have that.
Well, the other thing is that,
and it's not that the parents.
As pastor, what I notice, if I correct a kid or discipline a kid, I mean, by saying don't do that or stop that, I oftentimes get a call from the parent saying, why did you do that to my kid? Or why did you? When I was growing up, if my pastor corrected me, I would hope that I would never say it to my parents, because I'd get it when I got home too. You know what I'm saying? I'd get it double. Of course, your dad was the pastor, but Pete, go ahead.
Yeah, I know from my own experience in growing up, the medications and everything weren't really a thing where I was. My brother, in fact, who was 3 grades behind me, he was kind of a test case in those schools they diagnosed him as hyperactive, is what they said then. Yeah. But older than that, like me, there was nothing like that. But I know that junior high, 7th and 8th grade, those were the most cruel years of school. The kids would be mean to each other just to, I don't know, to exert power or whatever. But I know I'm also told that, today as you get older, high school, and to a certain extent, even when you get into an adulthood, if you have some sort of a mental issue, people reject you and push you away and isolate you because they don't want to have anything to do with you. And it's a huge problem.
Yeah, I don't know what the answers are on the other side. Sharon?
One more quick insight into this whole issue on teenagers and the complexity of their lives. My granddaughter that I was telling you about, her first attempt, she went to a counselor, and the counselor said to her, first words out of her mouth were, "What is your personal pronouns?"
Oh, geez.
And my granddaughter looked at her like, what's she talking
about?
But
yeah.
That's another issue that really makes life difficult for teenagers and kids of all age, really.
You have to sort all that through. Yeah. I know. I don't, I didn't grow up 500 years ago, but I mean, I never remember any kid who was on any sort of ADHD when I was growing up. I don't remember any kid who had celiac, and I know that's a big thing nowadays. I don't remember an EpiPen. I don't know any. I didn't know any kid growing up who had an allergic reaction. So I don't know if is our society, is there so many chemicals now that I don't know, or maybe it's a combination of all those things. But I just never, and I'm not saying there weren't people who had celiac disease or people that had allergies. I just didn't know about it, or it was never. I don't know. It wasn't part of my worldview at the time that people had those kinds of things, or they were on medications, or were hyperactive, or if somebody seemed hyperactive, I think they just set them in the corner or something. I don't know. Which maybe that wasn't fair either. Maybe that wasn't right either. But well, at any rate, we've talked about the structures of society, some of which help us, some of which hurt us. We've talked about this commandment, "Thou shalt not murder," which I really think that I want to interpret that as source of life, that we respect the life that God gave us. And next week we get into the 6th and 7th and 8th commandments. So and maybe even more. I forget what we have for next week. Next week we go all the way to, what do we do here? 64 to 70. Yes, we go to the 8th commandment. So we'll see, bearing false witness. None of us have ever done that. So we're all good on that score. But good to see you tonight. Thanks for letting me put you on the spot a little bit. And we will see you all next week at 6 o'clock. All right.
Thank you.
Blessings.
Bye.
Bye.